Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Student of the Game. I am Kyle Nash, the Student of the Game, and listen, you're here. Chances are you like talking sport, and hey, listen, I whatever game it is, I try to be a student of it. Thanks for coming in and being aboard here. I hope everybody's dealing with NFL withdrawal as well as am attempting to here tonight. Listen, while there is an Orlando-centric base here, we are not limited to topics of Orlando. Of course, I refer to tonight's guests, of course, my friend from the Black and Gold Banneret also does a lot of work with Fast Pitch News and another local outlets and things here in the Orlando area and out and about, actually, as well. He's going to be doing a remote broadcast of a softball game here in for Carolina in Carolina. I don't know how that works. He'll be here. The game will be in Carolina. That's what I understand. I don't know. Anyways, Eric Lopez will be on the show here shortly first. And of course, after that, good friend of the show. Normally we would have him as the college football guy who covers UCF. But since then, he's grown up even more, my friends. Jason Beede of the Orlando Sentinel, the Orlando Magic beat writer, will be aboard here as well to talk some NBA and All-Star game. And, we had to get a little of that in here before coming off the All-Star break. Of course, this past weekend was the NBA All-Star game. We'll talk to him about his experience with that and how all that went and all of these other scenarios that took place and went big in the NBA. But before we get into it, any of that, college football. I know. Kyle, the best way you can handle NFL withdrawal is talking about college football. Mescaline. No, I'm kidding. Listen, it's not so much stuff on the field that has grabbed my attention lately, but we all are aware that the coming football season in college will kick off the first effort at the 12-team playoff, at the extended playoff, at the bracket-style playoff, at least for Division 1 football. Already Division 2 and 3 have been doing it for quite some time with great success. And apparently, some heads got pulled out of some cavities out of particular important people's bodies, and they thought it might be a good idea to try it. Now, obviously, the biggest push and fanfare of it is, if we had it this year, FSU wouldn't have been excluded. Forget about the fact that it was correct that FSU was left out of the top 4, #deal with it. And the evidence of that came in a very interesting headline. Sure, I have already made plenty of noise about the decline in likely death of the ACC. Well, Thanos called and told me that I've found something more inevitable at this point. At the ACC's death certainly seems to be a thing that is all but certain, and there's no Iron Man to come in and make the snap instead. Matter of fact, FSU, who at the beginning of last season was making overtures and trying to find ways to break off from the ACC, already telling the world long before any debates took place to leave FSU out of the top 4, they themselves were debating and showing you with their actions, not debating literally, but showing you with their actions that this is a conference that needs to die and is at the very least incompetent, if outright obsolete. Please see the Big 12. Even though, ironically, the Big 12 had one of their best years this past season as almost like a swan song. And confirmation of that death, by the way, comes in the form of the college football playoff officially making the structure 5 and 7, right? Because previously it was 6 and 7, the Power 5 and a G5 with at-larges. Now it's 5 and 7 because there is no longer a Power 5. It's more officially a Power 4 now because the Pac-12 is, as we said, basically dead. However, FSU is in a position to where they're in, I don't know if we call this an entanglement. That means something completely different now, but they are at least in conflict through legal proceeding and posturing and mud hurling in the press and all this other stuff, to where something appears to be possible now, or at least acknowledged as possible, that wasn't previously. And that is FSU buying their rights, acquiring their rights from the grant of rights. So just as you understand, the ACC, all conferences have a deal where they grant their rights, a grant of rights, if you will, all their media stuff. That's how the conferences are able to then collectively bargain on behalf to get the TV people to the table, blah, 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 right? There's talk that FSU is at the table with the ACC. By the way, yeah, news, UCF changed conferences. No, stop it. But FSU is at the table, and the ACC is at least listening in a way that they hadn't been before. Because whenever sort of court proceeding gets involved, which FSU is suing the ACC, that's an active thing that's happening, right? Court cases are unpredictable. Should FSU win their court case, there's a potential for them to get their rights for free. Whereas if they wanted to buy out of the grant of rights, I think it's upwards of $500 million, right? Where's my Dr. Evil finger? Right? Okay? Or Dr. Evil Pinky, whatever. Dr. Evil finger. Don't look that up on Urban Dictionary. That just sounds scary. But listen. So I think the reason why the ACC is at least entertaining a settlement concept is to get cash for FSU's rights to possibly finance some other deals and some other efforts to expand to try to keep themselves alive and relevant. Now, granted, I know they got the juggernaut that is SMU out of the American. No offense to the American and Mike Oresco, but what is SMU really thinking they're going to get away with here by jumping to a dying Power 5 conference other than getting re-relegated back to the G5 when it's all done? But that's a separate conversation. With FSU, if this piece right here with FSU determines the fate of the ACC, who, by the way, still currently a part of the Power 5. But Kyle, why is that so relevant? That's a great question, especially when you see headlines out there that starting in 2016, there's talk of a 14-team expansion and a whole other hullabaloo there. Now, keep in mind, the way that this deal works for the college football playoff is that they took the current TV deal and crowbarred a 12-team bracket into it somehow, which, by the way, if you happen to be a bowl game fan, they just got made a lot more important. If you weren't a bowl game fan, but you like the college football playoff, you're about to become a bowl game fan, or at least for the ones that happened later in December. If you're one of these like me who doesn't watch a lot of the games that happen in bowls before Christmas, your late bowl season fan watching is going to be inevitable in itself if you want to see the college football playoff now in the 12-game format, or 12-team format, rather. But if the ACC is continued to be undermined, let's say they lose an FSU and a precedent is sent, is there any way we expect the ACC to not hemorrhage teams? And when that happens and 2016 rolls around and they renegotiate, will the ACC even be at the table? What will that look like? What would that do? And that's part of what we're going to talk to Eric Lopez about when he gets here shortly. But I'll put it this way. The ACC is going to find themselves in a whole heap of trouble. There are some teams there that have brands and are in football-rich surroundings, right? FSU, I mentioned as an example. They've not been great for a while. Let's remember, let's remember that FSU making it to 10 wins, not last year, but the year previous, beating a 6-7 Oklahoma team was considered a big deal. I was less impressed. Now, granted, when they came out at the beginning of last year and beat LSU in the Orlando Kickoff Classic, which I was present for with, ironically, Eric Lopez, though we weren't working for the black and gold Banneret that day. Bing! But that's a whole other question. that was FSU's then, making its big year. And listen, Coach Mike Nolan is somebody I've enjoyed. I obviously crossed his path when he was coaching for Memphis, and I was still writing for UCF. Again, not necessarily with the black and gold banneret, but, covering UCF and seeing what happened to him against UCF. But the punchline is this. When FSU moves, when Miami moves, some of these names were going to actually be tested in the ACC. Oh, but Kyle, Clemson's going to be just fine. I don't know about that, for example. Is anybody really impressed with Clemson's conduct and play lately? Now, granted, when I say conduct, I'm not here to say that they're going to have any sort of probation or penalty marked against them. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am implying is that Clemson, without Trevor Lawrence, has been less than impressive. And no, I'm not talking about them losing to Notre Dame during the pandemic year and all that other stuff. That's not what I mean. What I mean is you haven't has Clemson even sniffed the playoff since? Right? It's been pretty clear for a minute that before the American broke off UCF, Houston, and Cincinnati to lose them to the Big 12 and replace those teams. Granted, the fourth team for the Big 12 is BYU, for those who don't remember, right? Before that point, the American, I can make a strong argument as an entire conference, was better than the ACC. But who here is really impressed with the branding? And I know some blue bloods will hear this and be all like, and some blue blood fans will be, Kyle, this is ridiculous. Dabo is going to take out a business. Dude, he has been getting out-recruited and worked for some time now due to his antiquated approach to college football. And it's beginning to show. Right? That's obviously a problem. Then who else is supposed to impress me in the ACC, right? Granted, there's some ACC classic teams that aren't even in there anymore. Like I would first say Rutgers, but I'm like, wait, Big Ten. It's all confusing. But like Boston College, is that supposed to be an impressive group? Just as an example. Is who in the ACC, other than Florida and Miami, who, by the way, haven't really done well. Okay, not FSU, sorry. But Miami with Mario Cristobal was feigning prominence, and then they made a couple mistakes, like the whole situation in Georgia Tech and all that with the not kneeling on the ball, and that craziness just went completely awry. Then, over and above all of that, am I supposed to take like what? Boston College? I know they only beat FSU by a point, so obviously they're in the game. Who else in the ACC is left to really impress? So if those brands go, it could be problematic. I don't know. But I'm on record being an ACC hater, an FSU critic. I'm not going to say skeptic. That's too strong. I was in the presence of our guest here, who's about ready to jump in as he's in the virtual green room here. But I was with our guest at the Football Classic, Orlando Football Classic, in week 1 of the previous college football season, and said, and I quote, I'm pretty impressed by this defensive front, and showed, let's say, hope for FSU to be a playoff representative. And of course, I mean none other than my good friend, the Sultan of Stickball himself, my guy from the Black.
How you doing?
Hey, man, great to have you in. I don't know how much of the open here you heard, but obviously, listen, in matters of things Noler and Knight, and not if you're one of those people, I do tend to bring you in to bring in some voice of reason, so I can't just be accused of being a hater, and this is one such of those times. And I know you and I battled epic and waxed poetic about how FSU was, in my opinion, correctly left out of the college football playoff, But this has little to do with that. What I mean to say is FSU going after the ACC. For me, this is just the first true domino of what you've been hearing me say on various podcasts, including. Do you agree with that assessment that this is the first chunk falling off me?
Oh yeah, I mean, look at where we're headed with college athletics in general, with the playoff now finally going to 5 and 7 model, 5 automatic champions.
I mean, it was supposed to be 6 and 6, but then the Pac-U did the thing, or Pac-12 did the thing that I said it would.
It imploded, and I don't think the SEC and the Big Ten is satisfied with that. I think you'll see this format for the next 2 years, and I think after that, who knows? I think the SEC and the Big Ten is going to try to grab more control of this playoff, whether it be guaranteed spots or whatever. They're going to dominate this playoff, and I think Florida State knows that.
Yeah.
I think Florida State knows that the ACC, from a football standpoint, its days are numbered. Yeah. And I think if you're FSU, I think their goal is to get to one of those two conferences, the SEC or the Big Ten, within the next couple of years when they redo this playoff. And who knows what that playoff will look like, whether they stay with what they have now, whether they go to 16 teams, whether the SEC and the Big Ten basically say, this is our tournament, you're more than, and we'll maybe give you 2 spots. Who knows, right? How we can debate on what direction it goes. But if you're Florida State, you don't want to be left out, especially – like, we could debate about the whole thing this year with Alabama, but Florida State just saw up close them being left out. Whether you agree with it or not, you just saw it. So from a head standpoint, you're going to get left out in the bigger picture.
You mentioned that big piece of them not wanting to get left out. Obviously, that's the big deal. But I have floated I don't want to call it a conspiracy theory, but, maybe I need a tinfoil hat. You tell me. But I felt like, and it's not been talked about enough, and I think we talked about a little bit of this on the Black and Gold Banneret. Bing! But see, I do my own voice acting on this podcast, Eric Lopez. Let me make it clear.
Yeah, I noticed that, yes.
But I feel like FSU's effort to start kicking the tires to get out at the beginning of last year was involved with hurting their case trying to get into the top 4. Because not only was it about Jordan Travis being hurt, the ACC was also questioned, not just by me.
Well, yes.
Trying to get the team in question, trying to get out of that conference. Is that not an open display of the weakness, right?
Well, the funny thing is you and I actually agree on why Florida State was left out. Yeah. My issue was this was not they could say it was about the quarterback, but it was more than just the quarterback situation.
They were able to hide behind that. I got you.
It was a cop-out. But what they had, you brought it up. I agree with you. I think the ACC was not going to have Florida State's back in this situation, right? I mean, we agree on that. They just weren't going to, because the ACC was the head guy of the committee for the playoff, is an ACC guy. And I guarantee you, he was not fighting for Florida State. So that's number one. You add to the fact that I do believe that people at ESPN knew that Nick Saban was going to retire. That rumor was going. That rumor was going on throughout that late in that season. There were rumors, and I think they wanted to give him one more playoff run. Oh, by the way, where is he employed now, Kyle? Where is he employed? That's right, College Game Day. Wow, what a coincidence. So I think there were a lot of factors in play of why Florida State was left out. Look, I don't think it's at the end of the day forget the Florida State side of things. I think the right team won the national title.
Sure.
Which was Michigan. And I as much as I agree with Travis out, I don't think Florida State beats a Michigan on the field, right? Now, if Jordan Travis was healthy, we might have a different conversation, but
you still can't guarantee it, but it would have obviously been a better game. I don't think that's the argument. But listen, we're talking about FSU showing the ACC's weakness directly, it hurting their case. Now they're building on it for a minute. Do you I mentioned showing the ACC's weakness. Do you feel like them coming to the table and thinking about negotiating, selling them back their rights, is what do you read that to be kind of a sign of?
A sign that lawyers are doing their work. They're trying to figure out a loophole. Okay. I don't know. I mean, they're finding every language they can get out of this, right? They're trying to find any hole they can get. I think that was a little overblown. I don't think it's as simple as that sounds. Like, hey, you could just buy your media rights back and you're good to go, because otherwise other teams would do that, right?
Sure.
Right? But I think they are working on some ways to make this happen. They're trying to find some holes. And again, if you're the ACC, are you 100% sure you would win a legal case against Florida State?
And that's why they're coming to the table. You got it. Right.
Bingo.
Because while whatever they get is less than $537 million, it's still more than Bupkis. That's a fact too. And you also mentioned this, and I alluded to this a bit in the intro, Eric Lopez, but you mentioned, well, the other teams could just negotiate this. If I'm the ACC, my response is, I dare you to test the market, except for maybe Miami. I dare you to test the market and see what you could get from another conference.
When you say test the market, what you're talking about? You don't believe certain teams can get to that conference?
I don't believe that the Big Ten or the SEC would want, for example, Boston College.
I agree with that.
Right? That's where I'm coming from. Now, you mentioned to the SEC and the Big Ten. I would also argue, as a basketball conference, at least somewhat at its core, I think them jumping to the Big 12, or at least some teams being picked out to jump to the Big 12, makes sense too. The Dukes, especially.
Well, let's break it down. Let's break this down, because I think there's multiple pieces to this.
All right.
Florida State cares about football. Would you agree with that? This is why they're making this move. Right. With respect to basketball,
the whole reason they're in that basketball conference is your boy Bowden went to.
We don't need to get into the whole, 30 years ago where you were supposed to predict the future, type of this. Ain't Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox, all right, with Christopher Lloyd. Great movie, by the way, great series if you ever watched. I think if Florida State negotiated the deal, they would end up either Big Ten or SEC, probably the Big Ten, because the Big Ten doesn't have a Florida market.
No, they don't.
So, and then now the SEC would have to make an interesting decision there. Are you willing to let a Florida State or Miami go to the Big Ten and give and share that Florida market with the Big Ten? Or do you say, no, we'll grab Florida State to still keep control of this state of Florida? That's something that the SEC and their TV partners would have to make a decision on.
Do you think the SEC would not allow a chance? Florida might gripe, but bleep them. Do you think the SEC would dodge a chance to reinvigorate rivalry as much as we've heard it getting canceled? How excited would SEC fans be to have Florida State be relevant again?
I tend to agree with you. Yeah. I think Florida State and Clemson are banking on that. Those two in particular.
You're bringing up Clemson, man. I'm worried about him.
Dabo? No, again, does Clemson, for example, SEC take them so to make sure the Big Ten doesn't? I don't know. I think Florida State has a stronger, argument than Clemson, to your point. North Carolina, I know you and I have argued about North Carolina. North Carolina actually has the most brand out of all this, because both conferences would love to tap into the North Carolina market. And North Carolina, obviously, with the Nike, who Mr. Jordan, his airness, right? The basketball brand speaks for itself. They have a lot more going. I think both the SEC and the Big Ten would fight for North Carolina, big time. I don't know who wins that, but there would be a big fight for that.
I feel like too, and again, I mentioned it in passing, as a conference that is a budding football entity. They're obviously not the Big 12, the Big 10 and the SEC, but the Big 12 is consensus the number 3 group.
Yes.
I would think that North Carolina could possibly negotiate at a premium. I don't know what that looks like exactly. Maybe they get a little extra in their share. I don't know. We could wax poetic on the particulars, but sure. I feel like that not only would North Carolina be validated to join what is, again, consensus, the best basketball conference in the nation, Okay. And I don't think it's close. I think you'll agree with that, even though their officiating's a little iffy. We've had that conversation on
Yeah,
the
but I again, I don't think North Carolina will have to go to the Big 12. I think the ACC.
Hear me out. But then also they would be in a position to where their football team would maybe rise a few pegs because they've gotten a lot of hype and been awfully disappointing. Sam Howell. I don't get what people see in Drake May, but I'm told he's allegedly the second best quarterback in the draft.
Second or third, depending on who you read. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Hey, listen, I called BS when people loved Sam Howell while he was still playing against Trevor Lawrence, and I'm being proven right now as far as an NFL prospect. But even with those flops and these struggles and the constant failure to be ACC champions, they would be in a position to compete, I feel like, for a Big 12 championship before being in the middle of the SEC. Do you think?
But I think they're going to get more money from either the SEC or the Big 10. They're going to get a big, big payday. And that's what this is about, Kyle. Sometimes we complicate this stuff. It's all about the cash, homie. Right? Give me the most money. And North Carolina still thinks they can compete in football. I think that's laughable. But they think they're a football player in this as well. So, and they're going to get rewarded. I think the SEC and the Big 10 would actually pay more and fight more for North Carolina than they would a Florida State or definitely a Clemson. To your point.
What's the closest thing that the SEC has? Kentucky, right? You know, what's the closest thing the Big 12 has?
I don't even know.
You know, like Indiana's not a football power.
Now, I think the Big 12 will end up with teams like Louisville. Like, I think Louisville will end up in the Big 12 and get the scraps, is what I'm saying, for the Big 12. And try to be powerful in basketball, because I think Brett Yormark knows he's in a fight he's not going to win against the SEC and the Big 10 when it comes to the football side of things. He's not going to be able to dictate anybody about how football is going to work. But the leverage that he has is we're pretty darn strong here in basketball. And if you guys, whatever you have in mind for the basketball tournament, you're going to need us. So here's what I think this is what Brett would tell the SEC and Greg Sankey and Petit, the Big 10 commissioner. I think Brett Yormark would say, hey, I will help you pass whatever you want to pass from a football playoff standpoint, from a how do you want to run college athletic standpoint. I mean, he's made remarks about how this is a business, okay, and how people have not should have treated it like he ain't sugarcoating things, okay?
I was in the room when he made that. This is a business statement. Obviously, he made it several times, but I've heard it personally as well. Yeah,
correct. And I think what he wants in return, he's like, fine, SEC, Big 10, you want to have the majority of the money for football and all that, fine. Let us get a piece of the pie, but in return, I want more access to the basketball tournament. I don't want to have my 10th best team sitting at home because a team in the Missouri Valley has got a bid, right? I really do. I think he would want as many Big 12 teams, and let's get rid of the mid-major teams and more space. And he made that comment. He doesn't think the basketball championship right now is a true identification of a championship, which ticked off a lot of people.
Yeah, I don't get that precisely, but
because he believes, and I think Greg Sankey will agree with him on this, that the 10th or 11th best team in their particular conference is better than the conference champion from the Patriot League, for example, right? Okay. That's the argument they're going to make. The problem with that is the thing that makes the tournament so popular is the mid-major being in the mix.
Cinderella.
Correct. So I don't know if the tournament would be as interesting if you expanded it. Number one, if you expanded it, what's the point of watching the regular season game? What's the point of us talking about a January basketball game?
We already don't watch the regular season. I mean, I cover some games for the Black and Gold Banneret. Bing! But as a college football fan, basketball fan, that's your house, man. I rely on you to tell me about Quad 1 and things like that.
But the regular season as it is, it's not people tune in for March. If you expand this tournament 10, 20, 30 teams, it's pointless. Whatever. Everybody's in, they're playing for seeds. But I think that's what they want. They want more of the money on the basketball side. Because remember, the more teams you get into the basketball tournament, the more money your conference makes. That's the second big money maker behind football.
Let the mid-major keep what they got. If I can get more of my elite level Big 12 teams in, that's more money for me.
Well, that's the thing. What they got to decide is, do you do that by expanding the tournament and having more at larges, which the Big 12 would get, for example, or do you limit the automatic bids and try to take away from the mid-major? You could do it. That's what they're going to decide. But that's where we're headed with all this. Right. That's where we're headed with all this. You and I and Jeff argue about this. Jeff doesn't like to hear this, but this is the reality of the business side of it.
Jeff Sharon, head of the Black and Gold Banneret, does have some kumbaya moments, and I don't blame him for white knuckling and claiming and clinging to some things about the way they were. But listen, even whether money's the driving force or not, Eric Lopez, which it obviously
big.
is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I feel like college football, such as it has been formed to be a regional league, was way overdue for a reboot, right?
Some would argue with that. So I'm going to tell you, and listen, whether I like it or not, here's the devil's advocate from the football standpoint. College football will always be popular despite itself, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is, if you don't like whatever the direction the sport is headed, here's the thing, right? Everybody's complaining about, I hate the conference realignment and this makes no sense. What about the rivalry? Like, I remember all the people that are complaining about, UCF's not going to play USF on Black Friday. What are we going to do on Black Friday? Oh, I don't know. Maybe host maybe a top 10 Utah team this Black Friday. I don't know. That's a lot better to me.
Could be a thing,
It's pretty good. And I think in the end, football will always, here's what the networks are betting on. Because the diehards might have an issue with this and, hey, I want my rivalry and this or that. But you know this, the casual fan doesn't care about all this stuff that we're talking about. You know what the casual fan cares about? Turning on a TV on a particular Saturday at 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 7 o'clock, and what's on? Oh, there's a college football game. Ooh, Oregon's playing Michigan. I'm in, right? They're not thinking, man, this is terrible. I'm not going to watch this. This is horrible. What? I can't believe they're doing this for college athletic. No, they're just going to watch football. And I think what the networks are banking on, and I think they're going to win this, right? People are wondering, why are the TV networks so involved? Because let's say Texas against Alabama, that draws pretty well. Oklahoma versus Georgia draws. Michigan, Oregon. They're trying to duplicate what the National Football League has figured out, which is if you have compelling big-time matchups every week on a certain block, people will watch. People want to watch football. And so instead of limiting yourself and saying, let's watch Ohio State versus Rutgers or whatever, why don't we put Ohio State versus Oregon and get more eyeballs? And I think you're going to see a jump in the TV viewership from a football standpoint because there's more interesting matchups in the short term. Whether it's good for college athletics or not, whether it's good for the Olympic sports or not, that's a whole different conversation. But that's why the TV networks are doing this, and they're going to be right. I never said that the playoff won't draw viewers. It will, but it's not going to draw the big money that they think it will. And that's been proven out by this new ESPN deal because at the end of the day, you're not going to push over the NFL in their slots, TV slots.
Yeah.
And so as a result, college football is having some of their playoff games like on a Thursday and a Friday because they know they can't go against the NFL.
Yeah, and listen, once we get more solidarity on what that playoff's actually going to look like, I know you and I are going to have a segment, be it on this show, be it on the Black and Gold Banneret, or somewhere about how all the variant of scheduling failures that have been of late with the college football playoff. But hey, listen, now that they got more games, they have an opportunity to maybe test things and repair some stuff. Who knows? But Eric Lopez, great segment, man. Glad to have you in. An honor, joy, and privilege. Tell the world where you can be found, my guy.
Man, Eric Lopez Elo on social media, blackandgoldbanneret.com. I contribute there. Obviously, I write there, but I also do a softball podcast. I'm doing softball broadcasts remotely this weekend in California. That's why I'm wearing this unique headset.
Thank
you. It's not my equipment, but it's glad it's working. So I'm doing a little bit of, I got a lot of hats on. Eric Lopez Elo is the place to find all, but I'm trying to keep up with. I've got too many things going on, but it's fun, busy time, and always enjoy bantering with you.
And of course, your most important titles, including award-winning broadcaster for UCF softball.
That's right, 18th season.
And the Sultan of Stickball, as I know it.
That's your title. You have exclusivity to that.
All right. Hey, man, we'll catch you next time, brother. Talk soon.
Anytime, but
Always fun to run into Eric Lopez. But listen, I mentioned that this was a show of local heroes for Orlando. And listen, I shouldn't say last year, as soon as that, maybe a little long, I forget exactly how new this is for him to be the Orlando Magic beat writer for the Orlando Sentinel. But you would see a lot of coverage here locally from him at the Sentinel for UCF. He's evolved. He's in the pros quite literally. And a lot of significant coverage surrounding the Magic and the All-Star game this weekend here. Let's talk to him about it. My guy, Jason Beede of the Orlando Sentinel. What's up, my man?
Oh man, if I knew I was following Eric Lopez, I would have declined.
Don't. Hey, listen. I'll guide you through your experience following the Sultan of Stickball. It's going to be okay. We're going to get through this together, there, Beans. You're going to be all right.
It's great to be here. It's great to be here.
Good to have you in, man. Listen, I know. Listen, off the bat, I'm scheduling this with you, and it hits me upside the head right after I send the DM. Oh yeah, it's an all-star break, but Beats is still going to be working because Paolo Banchero is the franchise's 9th all-star placement. Do me a favor, give me a little context on how big a deal this is for the franchise.
Yeah, this was a really big deal. I think it really shows that this current rebuild, already was successful, but this current rebuild really has put a new face to the franchise. After they trade away Nikola Vucevic and brought in Jamal Mosley and really turned the tide from one era to the next, you always are, anxious, unsure. You do a lot of planning about who you're going to draft number one overall. And we've seen busts, we've seen players work out. And so far, Paolo has done everything he said he's going to do. He said he was going to be rookie of the year. He did that. He said he told me back in training camp that he was going to be an all-star this season. Well, he just did that. So, the next thing that he said he was going to do is make the playoffs this year. And that's something that, the Magic right now are in position to potentially right now if the make a play in potentially the playoffs as well. For Paolo to become an all-star and do so in a city like Orlando, and with the amount of votes he got from the fans, and then to be picked as a reserve by the coaches, just shows that not only are Magic fans paying attention to what he's doing, but so are those around the league. And it's absolutely a big deal that he was the first all-star uh, since Vucevic, and the 9th in Magic history. It's a really big deal for sure.
Yeah, 9 apparently is a magic number here this season. They broke the franchise record earlier in the year for a winning streak, getting 9 games pre-Christmas in a row. What was it? They got 30 wins in December, I think it was, which puts them months ahead of schedule to get on a playoff pace. So, hey, Paolo calling his shot makes sense from that standpoint. But let's do this too, because we just passed the trade deadline. I don't dare even try to think of being anywhere near you that Thursday because I know how it gets in free agency. But I mean, it beyond a reasonable doubt, the saying that's been out there is that the Magic, well, not saying, I mean, it occurred that the Magic stood pat. Everybody in the lineup, breathed a sigh of relief. The Magic alleged to be healthy, even though it would appear that Markelle Fultz will be missing. You write something about that on the Orlando Sentinel, bing, as they're heading into the road trip without Markelle Fultz. They mentioned standing pat was confidence in the team that they have, which I don't think that's untrue, he said with a double negative, but how much of that too is their buyers being aware of the wares that are there, right? Jonathan Isaac, a constant injury concern, obviously Markelle Fultz. And I mean, no disrespect to either of these guys. They are a pleasure to watch play basketball, but I mean, the best ability is availability, right? How much of that tied into the Magic not trading and that they didn't really have suitors to speak of?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's still needs for this roster, shooting being number one. I think a lot of people thought, who knows what Markelle Fultz is what's gonna happen to him this summer. He's on an expiring contract. They have to make a decision, an expensive decision potentially. He's obviously, when he's been healthy, he's been an important piece, right? I mean, we saw last year at the end of last season how Mechie helped them almost make the play-in. And this year, when he is healthy, uh, he offers a calming presence on the court, a veteran presence on the court. I think Anthony Black, the rookie who they drafted, number 6 overall, has stood in there at times, but I think that only can last so long just because right now he's a rookie, right? I mean, nobody, especially probably even Anthony, thought he'd be starting this many games as a rookie. I mean, you see what's happening with Jet Howard going back and forth between the G League and the NBA. You know, Anthony Black probably, if Markelle Fultz wasn't healthy, or if Markelle Fultz was healthy, Anthony Black probably could potentially would have been in that same path. I mean, we've seen when Fultz is healthy that Anthony, depending on the matchup, obviously he offers strong defense and whatnot, but he's in that third unit with Chuma and Gogo Batase, and they're not playing. So with all of that said, I think Markelle is still an important piece. He is their starting point guard. In regards to the trade deadline, I think you know even though they didn't make a move, if they had made a bad trade, that would have been a lot worse than no move at all.
Fair. Another point.
And the Magic know a thing or two about bad trades, right? We've seen that before, and obviously Jeff Weltman knows what he's doing, and his team are, they. It's not like they didn't make an effort to do any trades, to not do any trades. They did their due diligence, as I reported, and they made calls and put in the effort. And as Weltman told me a few weeks ago, that it takes 2 teams to make a trade. So how serious were those trade talks? You probably have to ask the other teams. So it's not that they didn't try. I think really at the end of the day, they feel confident that this group has gotten them to 30 wins, right? They're now entering the final stretch of the season with 30 and 25 with 27 left. And if they go 15 and 12, they'll finish with 45 wins, which last year was good enough for 6 seed, which means you missed the play-in. You're in a playoff series. You're playing the 3rd team in the East. So
Yeah.
I think, yes, there are needs, but at the same time, some fans need to understand that, they're on a timeline and they know their timeline. And, could you add a veteran presence and another veteran player, and get a sugar high and get a sugar rush? Sure. But that's just like putting a Band-Aid over a problem. It doesn't really, it's not really a cure for whatever the problem is long term. So I think they definitely did their due diligence, but at the same time, they feel confident about what they have. And Paolo Banchero was a big part of that confidence.
Yeah, and you mentioned Paolo Banchero. This is a conversation actually you and I have had, in that I think an element too about building confidence and building experience. This upcoming playoff run, assuming they achieve it, would be huge for Banchero to get experience under the big lights as the team's franchise guy.
And not just Paolo. I think Jalen Suggs has never been in the playoffs. Wendell Carter Jr.'s never been in the playoffs. Like Franz Wagner's ever been in the playoffs. Like people need to remember just how young this team is.
Yeah. Is Cole
and the fact that they have so many guys that Markelle Fultz and Jonathan Isaac were the only 2 guys from that 2019 or 2020 playoffs, 2020 playoffs in the bubble that they were last a part of. And with that said, there's so many guys on the team that doesn't have playoff experience. Obviously, Gary Harris is a guy that has playoff experience, and Joe Ingles as well. But the majority of the roster, the entire starting 5 almost, has never played in a playoff series before, and that's part of the growing process, right? I mean, just because they might get in that first round, and depending on who they're facing, if they finish as a 8th or 7th seed, that's going to be tough to beat Boston or Milwaukee or Cleveland. But they need to go through that experience, and that's something that Jeff Weltman said that they earned that opportunity to go through that experience and potentially make the playoffs. And at this point, in a play-in team pushing for the playoffs, they've earned that opportunity.
Yeah, and I think I've said on this show and in other places that 6 is kind of a best case scenario for a realistic landing spot for the Magic. And listen, they're in the thick of it too. They're tied with the Heat currently, neck and neck. And the Pacers are 1 game ahead. So I mean that's going to be a dogfight to get to that 6th seed, I think too. And then with Embiid being in and out of the lineup lately, they're 5th. I think they're going to crawl up. But I'll put it this way. Let's fast forward. Let's say the Magic actually, they get that 6th spot. they clear the play-in, and they win a series, which would probably be over, let's say, in Atlanta, a Chicago, an Indiana. Of the teams I'm about to list, who do you feel most confident that they could compete in the next round? I mean, I think Boston, Milwaukee, Cleveland, New York, or Philly, who do you think they would compete best with in a playoff series once they clear the first round?
Well, if they were the 6th seed, they probably face New York as the 3 in the first round.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually a pretty favorable matchup. They've beaten the Knicks 3 times. Of course, the third game, both sides were heavily and severely shorthanded, especially the Knicks in the last one before the break.
Yeah.
But they've beaten New York in New York, and they've beaten New York 3 times this season. They play them a 4th time next month, in a couple weeks, actually. I think New York is a really favorable matchup. At the same time, avoiding Boston, right? I mean, yes, Milwaukee's struggling, and Doc Rivers probably has in over his head a little bit. At the end of the day, they still have Giannis Antetokounmpo. They still have Damian Lillard. I think for a lot of these teams, beyond Boston, Cleveland right now is the top 2 team in the East. These are all really good teams with a lot of talented players that, they all have one thing that the Magic don't really, and that's playoff experience. The Knicks obviously are a team that's, they have someone in Jalen Brunson who's, maybe a dark horse MVP candidate, that maybe some doesn't get respect as much as he could have, wasn't named an East starter in the All-Star game, but obviously he's an important piece of that team. And, to have an experienced coach like Thibodeau leading the way, that's a tough Knicks team. So, I think avoiding Boston and Milwaukee is crucial for any chance. But first they got to get there. They got to get there, and that's why this final 27 games are so important. The majority of them are at home, and nothing's guaranteed in the NBA. They still have to put the work in, and as they say, take it one game at a time.
Yeah, well, I know Coach Mosley would have said the same, 100%. So with all that in mind, you mentioned getting a veteran presence. You mentioned not getting a sugar rush, which brilliant. 2 things you've said brilliantly tonight was A, that, and B, as the one with actual Greek blood here on the show, you nailing Giannis's last name is absolutely phenomenal. I think you're the first person I've heard do that on this show.
I think as someone who talks to these players, and obviously Giannis, I've only talked to a handful of times and whatnot, but I feel like it's so important to be able to say their names right. And I have a last name in Beede where everyone always says Beede. So I kind of get where a lot of these guys are coming from. You talk about a Gogo Bataze or Chuma Okeke, Paolo Banchero, Franz Wagner. It's an international sport, and I think learning how to say these names is such an easy thing for people to do.
Listen, this is why he's a journalist, folks. That's what a damn professional sounds like. But let me finish you off with this question. Let's get out the beads, he says as a joke, the beads magic crystal ball. Okay, and I think this is kind of a conversation I've had with you before too, but we'll do it here on the show. You mentioned a veteran presence. You mentioned not getting it short term here for that sugar rush, but typically championship NBA teams have a trio, a big 3. This isn't new, a big 3. People want to blame, LeBron for putting it together in Miami, and then they forget that the Bulls were a thing, and then they forget that Larry Bird even had a big 3. But that's a whole other thing. Obviously, Paolo is the number 1. I can make an argument that Franz Wagner is 2. Humor me, we'll say that. Okay. If they were to get a presence, I'll put it this way. Is the third guy in the building, which I don't think so, but you tell me. And if so, whom would you see that potentially being, or would they have to kind of draft for that?
Yeah, I think, absolutely Paolo and Franz are the 1-2. I mean, if anyone's untouchable on this roster, it's those 2 guys. And, there's a couple others, of course. But I think Wendell Carter Jr.'s, could be budding for that 3rd spot. He's obviously not your biggest center, and he has trouble around the rim, but at the end of the day, he still is their defensive anchor and can help spread the floor with his 3-point shooting. But as you mentioned before earlier in the show, availability is the best ability. And as we've seen this season, and past seasons, Wendell struggled with that. But as he said before the break, Orlando treats their big men nicely with, talking about the different eras of centers they've had. So I think he wants to become that third piece. I mean, uh, I remember going back before training camp or around that time, Hito Turgulu said, him, Franz, Paolo are foundational pieces that the franchise can build around. And of course, if something doesn't work after a certain amount of time, you have to move on. Um, I think Orlando is a spot where they have a lot of cap space coming into the summer. They've recently been tied to a Klay Thompson or someone like that. Um, Knowing Jeff Weltman, I think that they're going to be calculating whatever they decide to do. And they've made it this far so far homegrown. They've made a couple of key trades, of course, to acquire Wendell, to acquire Markel. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting to see, obviously. Um, I'm not giving a big name, but it is hard to get a read on what they're going to do in the future. But they feel confident. I mean, I think having those two guys, of course, getting a healthy point guard and getting another big man who can really change things for you, beyond what Wendell Carter is able to do. But they feel confident what Wendell can be, and I think he's still really young too. So it's just a building process for sure.
So, and I think something that would be very interesting too is, let's say they go like you're talking about and label Wendell Carter Jr. The third of the big three. The argument could be too that you just go in and get a couple veteran shooters maybe and try to all perimeter around that. Another option. So I could see that.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of options. I mean, we've seen how important Joe Ingles has been this season to the second unit. And obviously he's a little bit towards the end of his career. I don't think he's afraid to admit that. But with that being said, his for how important he's been, imagine someone a little bit younger who has that experience. I mean, there's players out there that, they can make a run at in free agency. They have tons of draft stock. They have tons of cap space moving forward. That's one reason why they didn't feel pressure to make a move at this deadline, knowing what they can accomplish this season. And like I said before, they're on their timeline, going according to plan so far, it seems. And nailing Paolo Banchero was that first one that was so important, and so far so good. So they're just going to continue to evaluate what they have, and if something feels right, they have the pieces to make the right moves.
So, well, hey, I appreciate you recalibrating my point of view on that. I appreciate you analyzing the entirety of the top of the East, so we can get something for every NBA fan here. And man, thanks for jumping in. This is why I call you friend of the show. This is why I use the big J when I call you a journalist. Jason, tell the world where you can be found, my guy.
Yeah, at the Real Beede on Twitter, of course, OrlandoSentinel.com. We still have a print newspaper. Check that out. That's pretty fun. But yeah, at the Real Beede on Twitter is where you can find me, and OrlandoSentinel.com is where you can read all my work.
There you go. I've known this kid since he used to wear green photo vests. I love it. Hey, good to have you. We'll catch you next time, brother.
Thank you.
An honor, joy, and privilege to have him. Listen, the Orlando-centric show. I told you tonight, some guys who know what they're doing, some guys with that experience that Jason was talking about. Great to have him in. Of course, special thanks, of course, as well to Eric Lopez for coming in. And of course, I am Kyle Nash, the student of the game. You can find me on Twitter, Threads, Instagram at the SOTG. Find me on Facebook as a student of the game. Check out my writings with the 3-point conversion, the Jaguar Report, and the Black and Gold Banneret. I will be in the building at Addition Financial Arena this weekend doing some women's basketball for UCF. So check out that stuff on blackandgoldbanneret.com. Bing! And of course, my appearances on the Night Shift podcast with the Black and Gold Banneret. Of course, the streaming platforms as well. You could catch I am the SOTG on Twitch. Find the live streams of both A7BN Sports Facebook page, Sertoba Media, and the Huddle Up Podcast YouTube page. And of course, I'm assuming you're listening to this on a pod. If you were watching the stream and you miss 1 week, all your podcasts, the student of the game, all your podcast catchers, it will be there. If it's not, let me know. I'll find him. I will find you. But listen, great to have everybody aboard. Thanks to the snowman himself jumping into the comments here with some laughs about me bringing up Cristobal. And of course, special thanks to all of you for coming to check in here on this week's edition of the Student of the Game podcast. An honor, joy, and privilege to host you all. But until next time, everyone, class dismissed.